Welcome to online vaccination science resources for COVID-19 education. My name is Davida Smith and I'm an Associate Professor of Natural Sciences at Eugene Lang College of Liberal Arts at the New School in New York City. This presentation is the second in a series of 4 presentations aimed at introducing you to science. This presentation will focus on the language of science. Having completed the module and the homework associated with the module, students will be able to understand the language of science and be able to use common scientific terms and vocabulary in varied contexts. Students will also be able to recognize the value of effective scientific communication and how miscommunication can lead to misconceptions and disengagement with the scientific process. What is scientific language must begin with the language of science. English is certainly the language of science, with over 90% of all scientific publications being written in the language. Before the 17th century, scientific publications were mostly written in Latin, and this was because Latin was spoken by the so-called elites. This image shown is a page from On the Generation of Animals, which was written in Latin and is one of Aristotle's major texts in biology. It describes the means by which animals reproduce. There are several examples of ancient scientific writings. The Mesopotamians are known for their technological advances. Among them, they were the first to use the potter's wheel to make better pottery. They pioneered irrigation to get water for their crops. They innovated with bronze and later with iron metal to make strong tools and weapons, and they developed looms to weave cloth from wool. They left behind cylinders such as the one shown that recorded their day-to-day activities. The ancient Egyptians were inventing writing, as shown here, and advancing the sciences of maths, medicine and astronomy while much of the world was living primitively. They developed ways to measure time and distances, and they applied their knowledge to create monumental architecture that stands to the present day. Among the ancient Greeks, Aristotle, pictured here with Alexander the Great, made pioneering contributions to all fields of philosophy and science. He invented the field of formal logic, and he identified the various scientific disciplines. He explored their relationships to one another. He also had students and founded his own school in Athens called the Lyceum. In the 15th through the 17th centuries, scientists used 2 languages, their native tongues and Latin. Their native tongue was used when discussing their work in conversation, and Latin was used in their written work or when corresponding with scientists outside their home countries. And this was because nobody owned Latin. Scholars across all of Europe and Arabic societies used it. Latin became a fitting vehicle for claims about universal nature. But people were also polyglots. They were able to choose the language to suit the audience. So for example, when writing to international chemists, Swedes used Latin, but when conversing with mining engineers, they often would use Swedish. As the scientific revolution progressed, through the 17th and 18th centuries, Latin began to fall out of favour with the scientific community. Galileo Galilei published his discovery of the moons of Jupiter in Latin, Sidereus Nuncius, in 1610, but his later major works were in Italian, and this was because he was aiming to get a more local audience for patronage and support, and so he switched languages. Newton's Principia from 1687 appeared in Latin, but his Optics of 1704 was in English. As the shift made it more difficult for scientists to understand the work done outside of their home countries, the community began to reevaluate and slowly consolidate the languages once more. By the early 19th century, just 3 languages, French, English and German, accounted for the bulk of scientists' communication and published research. By the second half of the 20th century, only English remained dominant as the US strengthened its place in the world, and its influence in the global scientific community has continued to increase ever since. But you might ask yourself, do scientists even speak English? This word map shows some common scientific prefixes and their meanings. Sometimes it can seem as though scientists are speaking a foreign language. And this is due to a variety of factors. The first is that scientific language often differs in tone. It generally is impersonal, it can be formal, and it's subjective. The language is clear, it's concise, it's unambiguous, it's free of metaphors, but it often contains jargons or scientific terminology. The writing is often very structured. Papers and posters are generally produced following a very fixed structure: an abstract, an introduction, a results, a conclusion section, and a bibliography. Scientists often write in the third person as well, and this is because it's generally not just a single person who would contribute to a scientific publication, but it's usually a team of investigators. And lastly, we use citations. Text usually has supporting references, and this is due to the fact that scientists credit the work of those who've gone before, and they also add to the literature themselves. So you'll always find citations accompanying a scientific publication. So let's examine the morphology of words. These tables are very busy, but what they show are common prefixes and suffixes and roots in science. This first one shows the prefixes. A prefix is attached to the start of a word and serves to produce a derivative word. So examine this table and see if you recognize any of the words and what they mean. Some that jump out at me are auto, self, autoimmune, bio, life, biology, or epi, upon, epidermis. Suffixes, on the other hand, are also used in science, and they're attached to the end of a word and give that word a new meaning. Again, examine this table to see if you recognize any of the words and their associated meanings. Arium, place for, aquarium, water. Cule, very small, molecule. Ology, study of, biology. Many of the words we just saw have their roots in Latin and Greek. You'd be surprised to know how many words that we use today in our common language actually have their roots in Latin and Greek. Consider these roots shown. Can you identify some additional examples right now? Once more, you'll notice anti, against, antibacterial, antidote, antithesis. Auto, Greek, self, automatic, automate, autobiography. And one more time, bio, life, biography, biology, biodegradable. A great example of a word that derives from the Latin is vaccinus, from vacca, for cow, and this is because of the early use of the cowpox virus against smallpox in the first vaccines. Compare this with variola, or an infectious disease causing pustules or pox, vaccina or cowpox. The word comes from vacca and inus, of or pertaining to. And there are words with a common origin in many other languages, including Italian, vaccine, Portuguese, vaccina, or Spanish, vacuna. Many of these science-sounding prefixes, suffixes, and roots are more common than you realize. For example, an ology is simply somebody who has a specialty in a particular area. It sounds very sciencey. So look at these examples: gemologist, enologist, or immunologist. Let's pause for a moment and see if you can guess what these words actually mean. A gemologist is somebody who studies gems, and particularly they appraise gems or figure out their value. An enologist is somebody who studies wine and winemaking, and an immunologist is someone who studies immunology or the immune system. Another thing that's very important to understand is context. The context matters when you use language and words as well. So let's begin with this one. What comes to mind when you think of the word cell? I'm going to ask that you grab a piece of paper right now and a pencil or a pen and write down all the words that you can think of when you think of the word cell. I'll give you 20 seconds. I'm counting. So for me, when I think of the word cell, I think of these examples. These are some excerpts that mention the word in context. The first, it is sufficient to note here that cells were first of all discovered in various vegetable tissues by Robert Hooke in 1665. Malfigi and Grew gave the first clear indications of the importance of cells in the building up of plant tissues. But it was not until the beginning of the 19th century that any insight into the real nature of the cell and its functions were obtained. A fuel cell uses the chemical energy of hydrogen or another fuel to cleanly and efficiently produce electricity. If hydrogen is the fuel, electricity, water and heat are the only products. Fuel cells are unique in terms of the variety of their potential applications. They can provide power for systems as large as a utility power station and as small as a laptop or computer. The last one is my favourite. It was also during the First War that Alistair Moody, famous Auror, captured many Death Eaters, which resulted in half the cells in Azkaban are full thanks to him. It's a Harry Potter reference if you're a fan. So when I think of cells, these are the examples I think of. On the left, you see on top a plant cell, a model representation, a visual representation of what a plant cell looks like. And on the bottom, you see an animal cell. So when I think of the word cell, I automatically think of biological cells. The one in the middle is actually a prison cell. And this is a rather luxurious prison. This prison cell, this was Al Capone's prison cell when he was in prison. And the last example there is a fuel cell. And this is an example from Idaho National Laboratory. Let's pause here for assignment 1.